Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar on Levelling Up and Transport for London. My name is Claire Harding and I'm the Research Director here at Centre for London. For those of you who don't know us, hopefully many of you do know us, we're London's dedicated think tank. We hold events and conferences, we produce research, that's mostly my job or a large part of my job, and we also live stream public webinars like this, and all of this with the aim of tackling London's biggest challenges and advocating for a fair, sustainable and prosperous global city. So grateful to you all for joining us today to discuss the uncertainty about Transport for London's finances and how this might impact on London's ability to level up from within, and in particular what a managed decline of transport services might have on lower income Londoners. We know, of course, that this managed decline scenario is just one that might result from the TfL funding agreement. We once again find ourselves in the position of waiting for a TfL funding agreement. I'm not quite sure what's going to be in it. This time we have the extra excitement of waiting for a Levelling Up white paper as well tomorrow. So yeah, a lot of uncertainty at this stage about what's going to happen. And I think it's worth saying that there are different narratives coming from the Department for Transport and from TfL and the GLA at the moment. This discussion today is part of a year-long project by Centre for London looking at what levelling up means for our city. Lots and lots more to come on this. We'll talk about it briefly more at the end, and please do get in touch if you'd like to get involved with that. Before we start to introduce our absolutely brilliant panel today, I'm going to quickly run through our agenda and share some tips, not that you probably need them by now, on how to take part using Zoom. So in a few minutes, I'm going to introduce our panel and ask them all to say a little bit as an introduction and then their perspective on the importance of TfL funding and what that means for different groups in London. And then we'll get a discussion going with the panel. After that, we will bring in your questions from the audience. That's always one of my favourite parts of these things. It's always so interesting. So please do submit questions if you would like to through the Q&A function, and you can also upvote other people's questions, which is great. It's so much easier if we have 10 people who voted for a question on a particular topic than 10 slightly similar questions which sort of overlap each other. As a chair, the former is so much easier, so really appreciate it if you could use that function. Please also use the chat function to share reactions and comments, links to ideas, anything connected to this discussion. Very grateful for that, and please do include your name and organisation when you do that so we know who you are. We're streaming on YouTube. Some of you might be watching us on YouTube as well as here on Zoom. So, and we'll be saving for further viewing if you have friends or colleagues who'd like to watch this afterwards. And if you're not on the Zoom chat, or if you prefer Twitter, you can also participate in live discussions using the hashtags TfL Levelling Down and Levelling Down. If you have any trouble with the Zoom webinar, please do move over to YouTube and you can see that on our website at centreforlondon.org. I hope that won't happen, but always good to have the backup if your Zoom does decide to misbehave a little bit. I'm going to introduce our speaker panel now, which is always an absolute pleasure and a privilege. We've got 3 really brilliant panelists today, who I'm going to ask to speak in order, and then we'll open the discussion. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Alan Benson, who is a transport campaigner and the chair of Transport for All. Thank you so much for joining us, Alan. Next, we'll be hearing from Dr. Zubaida Haque, who's the executive director at the Equality Trust. And finally, we'll be hearing from Matthew Walsham, who's the policy lead at Partnership for Young London. I'm sure some of you will have had the opportunity to hear from Alan and Zubaida and Matthew before, all absolutely brilliant speakers. We're really looking forward to hearing from them. So I'm going to come to Alan first, if you'd like to give us your reflections on the financial challenges for TfL and what that might mean for vulnerable people in London. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Claire, and good morning, everyone. So I've really got 2 areas that I want to cover that particularly impact disabled Londoners. And the first is a social moral perspective, and it's centered around getting disabled people fair access to allow them to live their lives. So disabled people are disproportionately more likely to be in poverty, than other groups. And they're also more frequently also part of another protected characteristic. So there's a certain intersectionality which makes things, which compacts things. And the impact on transport in London for disabled people, as identified by the mayor, is that journeys take around 40% longer due to inaccessible infrastructure or inaccessible vehicles. So if we start cutting either services or investment in London, that's definitely going to make things worse. For most people, for example, there are 60 odd seats in a bus. For a wheelchair user, there is one. And it's quite frequent that I, as a wheelchair user, can't get on a bus because that space is already used. If you've got fewer buses in service, longer waiting times, then it's much more likely that I'm going to be waiting even longer because those buses are fuller. If we look at things like investment in infrastructure, more modern buses, more modern trains are much more accessible. So it's really important to keep that going. And then if we look at just operational cuts, things like lack of assistance on platforms, the drive for cashless on our transport networks is going to disproportionately affect disabled people. And there's an economic case for maintaining investment in our transport. So the ONS have released statistics a couple of years ago that says for every pound that's invested in our transport networks, there's a £6 return. Now, there aren't many places you can get that level of return on that investment. And you've also got the purple pound. If anybody's not aware of the purple pound, go and Google it. Basically, it's £273 billion that disabled households have to spend every year. If people can't get out to spend that money, either in shops, leisure, work, and we're missing out on that just as part of that levelling up agenda that's been pushed by the government. And another statistic is that a third of disabled people have turned down work due to inaccessible transport. They simply can't get there. So if you want disabled people to not only participate in society, but to make an actual financial contribution, then we've got to give the facilities to be able to get in there and contribute, and as well as spend money, work and pay taxes. So there's a real solid economic argument as well as a social argument for investing in transport in London for disabled people.
We've been doing Zoom for nearly 2 years and I still failed to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Alan. Loads of really interesting points there, taking us from the very, very specific and real to the overall economic argument, and I'm sure we'll come back to many of those. Just a reminder, if you have questions that you'd like to ask our speakers, if any points that you'd like to ask them to expand on, please do put those in the Q&A. Going to come to Zubaida next from the Equality Trust. Thank you, Zubaida.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you, Alan. I think you've given us quite a lot of food for thought there in terms of the lack of equality impact assessments when it comes to looking at services. And I'll say a little bit more about that because it is quite significant. if you like, not only in terms of whether sufficient equality impact assessments have been carried out on services and routes and accessibility, but also in terms of the long-term consequences in terms of managing the decline of Transport for London, in terms of managing the cuts to services. But as I said, I'll say a little bit more about that. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're really happy to have you here, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to Centre for London and to Claire for inviting me. I'm on a great panel. My name's Dr. Zubaida Haque. I'm the relatively newly appointed Executive Director of the Equality Trust. I'm also the former Interim Director of the Runnymede Trust, which is a race equality think tank. The Equality Trust is a charity which basically looks at inequality and reducing socioeconomic and other kinds of inequality. I also wear another hat, which is I'm a member or a voluntary member of Independent Sage. So if you want to talk about the pandemic, I can talk to you about the pandemic and navigating the pandemic, or not, if you're the government. Anyway, back to transport. Now, what I want to really focus on in terms of London transport is really, and this is something that's not often looked at, is the differential benefits and the differential impact of London transport on different groups. Now, what's quite interesting is when you look at how much people spend on London transport, you find that on average, for instance, that Londoners spend more on transport than people in other regions. But what's also interesting is when you look at within London, there are huge variations on not only how much people spend, but more importantly, what portion of that spend is of their income. So on average, Londoners spend around, and this may vary, and Claire, I'm sure, will hopefully tell me the right figure, but they spend around a monthly average of £137 per month on London transport, which is about 7% of their income. But when you look at younger people, when you look at skilled manual employees, when you look at key workers, when you look at those people on zero-hour contracts and so on, how much those groups spend on London transport is much higher. So it goes to about 10% or more of their income. And that has consequences, of course, in terms of what kind of transport you can use. And what's interesting is when you disaggregate what kind of transport people use in relation to their income, you find that those on lower incomes tend to use bus services more than they use underground services. And surveys have repeatedly shown that cost is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, barrier to using underground services for lower income groups. In terms of equality, what's interesting about London is when it comes to looking at connectivity of transport and deprivation, there's actually not a very strong relationship. And that's quite unusual. You would have expected that there to be much poorer connectivity, much poorer services and so on in deprived areas, but actually it's relatively similar. And that's the nature of London across. But that doesn't mean that when services are cut, when there is reform of Transport for London because there's not enough money, when they are managing the decline, as they say, as narrative goes, that's not going to have a disproportionate impact on different groups. It will have a disproportionate impact on disabled groups, on lower income groups, on BME areas, which are disproportionately poor. It will have that impact. And I think one of the things we need to acknowledge about London is, while on the one hand, it's always seen as the affluent metropolitan city, and certainly in terms of the government's discussion on levelling down, there isn't much said about London. But some of London boroughs have the highest rates of child poverty in the country. It's just not often acknowledged, but we do. You know, when you look at Newham, when you look at Hackney, when you look at Tower Hamlets, those are the boroughs that fall in the top 10 areas of highest rates of child poverty, which matters when it comes to young people travelling on TfL. And we know, of course, and I'm sure Matthew will talk a little bit more about this, that the government threatened, and this is still very much an issue, of increasing, of removing the free fares for under 18-year-olds last year. And there's a big revolt against that. And rightly so, there's a big rebellion against that, because we know that young Londoners rely on cheap fares to go to school in other boroughs, to access jobs, to access museums, to access leisure. That London, because of the nature of London, because of the way it's geographically spread, a lot of young people need to get on public transport, need to go on the underground to go to school and so on. So raising fares will not only have an impact on lower income groups, it will also have an impact on Black and ethnic minority children, who, as I mentioned, are disproportionately poorer. And I suppose that goes back to the issue that Alan raised at the beginning, which is that I think one of our biggest concerns at the Equality Trust is we can't say very much about whether, well, we can't say very much about how much services should be cut by. I think, you know, that we'll have to see in terms of how much the government supports TfL, and hopefully come February the 4th, the government will financially support TfL in terms of its money lost. But what we can stress and what needs to happen are the equality impact assessments, are those socioeconomic assessments of cuts to services in terms of who it will affect, where that effect will take place, what kind of routes it will affect, what kind of services, whether it will be disproportionately bus services that get cut or tube services. And as I mentioned at the beginning, cutting bus services will disproportionately affect lower income groups. So there's lots of questions around that. And I think there's also questions around how Sadiq Khan approaches or minimizes the impact on lower income groups, on Black and ethnic minority groups, on disabled groups in London, and what kind of initiatives. You know, there's been talk about raising council tax, but actually council tax is a very regressive tax anyway. I think that requires, you know, there needs to be some reform. There are all sorts of issues, but at the very minimum, there needs to be a proper consultation exercise and a proper equality impact assessment. I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much, Claire.
Thank you so much, Zubaida. And last but by no means least, I'd like to hand over to Matthew from Partnership for Young London, who I imagine will want to talk specifically about the importance of TfL to younger Londoners.
Brilliant, thank you. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Matthew Waterham. I lead on policy and campaigns at Partnership for Young London. I think very specifically, we did a piece of research kind of 2 years ago, and as my other panelists alluded to, you know, the government was basically looking at cutting travel for under 18s during the coronavirus pandemic, and they kind of made it a condition for the £1.6 billion bailout for TfL in May, I think, 2020. So, you know, I completely echo this idea that we really need sort of really good equality impact assessment, because part of the issue is, you know, with all those conversations going on, you know, that equality impact assessment hadn't quite taken place yet. I think it's moving on it. You know, you saw a groundswell of opposition, great campaigning by a young mayor of London, and really a backlash against it. But it was seriously on the cards. And I think it's one of these really interesting things where actually the impact of this would have been huge. You know, we're looking at kind of what the funding crisis for TfL means, but, you know, I'll give some examples from our report around what would happen if free transport was cut for under 18s, but actually to a less severe rate. You know, a lot of these adverse effects will happen if you have a rates increase as well. As has already been alluded to, there's a huge cost of living crisis for young people, personal debt, housing, you know, all the data, it's all depressing, there's a big list of it. So transport is one of those things that's already taking a percentage and proportion of people's income. So even an increase of it will change behaviours and will limit opportunities. So I kind of want to look at two things. Firstly, the first one is that impact on their education and employment. When we look at young people and ask them about how they get to school or get to work, overwhelmingly it is buses to get there. Partly this is because, of locality, because their schools are usually within a one bus ride away. And usually this is because they've got an under 18 travel card. But actually, if young people had to pay for transport, 72% of young people said that they would have to change the way they get to school if they had to pay for transport. And when we asked how they would change how they get to school, they would increase the number of buses they would take, because the train is too expensive. 40% of them said they would just walk. We're talking 3-4 kilometers, they would just start walking every day. And actually, again, it's really dependent on the group that you're speaking to. So we found that care experienced young people are more likely to take more forms of transport to get to school, far less likely just to take one form of transport. They're living further away from, their school or their college. When we did a piece of research with single young parents, the additional costs of transport when they're taking employment opportunities because they need to drop their kid off at childcare, which is already really expensive. So it's also disproportionately impacting different groups. The one thing which is really clear from all the research we do is young Londoners aren't this big homogenous whole. They are incredibly diverse depending on their area, different living circumstances, and the way that they approach transport is different. So in terms of, for example, transport, if you increase the cost, it also will change how long it takes. Because young people are less likely to catch trains or more expensive forms of transport, they're more likely to catch more buses, which will take longer. I did a focus group and they'll happily sit on a bus for 2.5 hours, 2 buses, rather than catch a train that takes 40 minutes. And obviously this is out of necessity, but there is a huge time cost for it. And when we did the survey, Black and ethnic minority young people, Asian young people, far more likely to change how they get to school, far more likely to catch more buses. And part of that is around the mental health impact, anxiety around personal finances. 64% across all of our surveys said that they were worried that their parents would struggle to make ends meet if they had to pay for transport. It's even young people before the point in which they're, in control of their personal finances. They're so acutely aware of the financial, the cost of living crisis, that they were worrying about their parents, their family, and how they would afford to do it. Just less than half, about 45% of our survey said that their mental health would struggle if they had to pay for transport because of that anxiety. And all of that not only increases the amount of time, reduces the amount of options they have, but it has an impact on educational choice. So again, 50% of our sample, less 45%, said that they would change the college or school they were considering attending because of transport costs. That's how they're making decisions around it. And as already alluded to, it's not just their kind of formal education, but museum and cultural opportunities. We did a piece of research in the Museum in London. We found that access into these spaces is heavily dependent on socioeconomic background and ethnicity, and already not being accessed by outer London boroughs and certain minority groups. And this would even be even more the case if transport went up or it got cut. Museum and cultural opportunities are kind of the first to go, because they're not seen as much as necessities, even though they, are a really important part of people's development in London. And on work opportunities, there is clear evidence already out there about the kind of disincentive going to see job opportunities going further out, especially if you're looking at young people. Work experience, it has to be relatively local. Transport has to be there to support them, because otherwise, how do you balance that with your studies? And I think with the apprenticeship numbers, and I think we'll talk about this more when we're looking at the Levelling Up paper, we know we've got a real problem with apprenticeships in London. And young people are very acutely aware that the rate for 16 to 18-year-olds is like £4.30. Actually, they usually think it's like £3 or something, and they're pleasantly surprised. But they're aware it's incredibly low. So if you get a 30% off travel apprenticeship, Oyster card, yes, it does help, but it's still adding up. It takes away from that hourly cost, and it makes it kind of difficult to afford for some young people. And the kind of last thing I'll kind of touch on is it has all of this impact about where they go, what opportunities they access. But I think we always commonly look at transport based on its economic benefit, which is obviously a really, really key thing, and it's far more quantifiable, it's great. But actually what's really interesting to me is how transport, especially TfL, has become this kind of institution. It's become a point of identity for young people. We did that in 2009, the DLA under Boris Johnson did a survey of young people, and they asked, what's the best thing about living in London? And 20% of the survey said that it was transport. It was ranked the 7th best thing in London. We did it again with a similar sample in 2021, and actually 40% was the best thing about living in London. It went from 7th best thing to 3rd best thing. When we ask young people about transport, it's not about work experience, it's not about education necessarily, it's about this concept of freedom, that they can go where they want, they can speak to their friends, they can go and access the opportunities. And it's a part of that London identity and narrative, being on the school bus with your friends or whatever. It's not necessarily, taking the car ride or school bus in other contexts. And because it's such an important part of their identity and their narrative and how they access opportunities, I think one of the key things we find them asking for is wanting to feel involved in how they're included in service design and delivery. When we ask young people about services like youth services in their local area, 9 out of 10 said that they don't have any say in how those are set up or run. And I think PFL is also a really important part of that. How are we involving young people in the design, in feeling the sense of ownership over those spaces and actually listening to what they want? They clearly have some clear things around safety, especially going out at night. How do you make transport safer for young people, all young people across the area? There's stuff about access, in terms of cycling. The cycle hire scheme is really not kind of spreading out South London or more socially deprived areas or areas that actually would really, really benefit from it. And then lastly, that kind of impact on particular groups as well. So, London Children and Care Council, they were asking Sadiq Khan for free transport for care leavers up to 25. I think Sadiq had said that, free buses and trams, but they want to go further and talk about trains. And looking at disabled young people as well, we did a piece of research. And actually, if we're looking at employment opportunities, what's the role of travel training? And how do we support employers to kind of level up by actually making sure that opportunities are accessible to all of those young people by actually thinking about what's the additional support that they need in transport to access these opportunities. Quite a lot there, but I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Your discussion of buses and freedom took me straight back to being on the 113 bus, which anybody else who grew up in northwest London may know is kind of the main bus route that takes you all the way to Oxford Street, and then all the way back again with your shopping bags from H&M, as it would have been then. Yes, an important part of growing up in London for many of us, and I think we mustn't underestimate the importance of transport to everybody's social development. I think if there's one thing that the pandemic has shown us, it's how important social time is. And the city the size of London, it's pretty unlikely for most of us that we'll be living within walking distance of everybody who we might happen to want to speak to. Loads of really good points raised by our panelists there, and also some great questions coming in on the Q&A. Thank you so much to everybody who's already asked those. There really is no such thing as a stupid question. I know that sometimes when you're sort of sitting in the audience for these things, you can feel like maybe you haven't asked this question because the answer must be really obvious to everybody. It's almost certainly not. So if you're thinking of asking a question, but you're maybe worrying that it might not be a good question or it might be the wrong question, please do ask it. It's almost certainly a good question, and we'd really love to see as many as possible. I'm going to, just before we come to that audience Q&A, I'm going to ask, feel like I must, one question to our panel now about the Levelling Up white paper, which we expect to see tomorrow, although we have expected to see it before. And that is, what, very briefly, if you will, because I think this is a question that we could take a long time answering, what do you hope to see in tomorrow's white paper? If I could come to Alan first, if that's okay, Alan?
So one thing I would hope to see in it, which I can almost guarantee that we won't see in it, is that this narrative that seems to be developing of London versus the rest of the country, and I definitely don't think it's an either or. I think London desperately needs funding, but I also think the rest of the country desperately needs funding. And I think if you don't fund everybody at an appropriate level, then we're going to significantly lose out. And we've got to remember, of course, as is regularly repeated, London's the only major city in the world whose transport infrastructure, whose transport networks don't receive subsidy. And I think that's something that we mustn't lose sight of. And the other thing to repeat, of course, is that the money spent on London's transport, particularly in infrastructure investment, doesn't just benefit London. You know, if you're buying trains, or buses, they're not built in London. They're built elsewhere in the country. So that money is spread out. Investment in London and investment in transport across the UK is not a drain, it's a pump priming exercise. And that's what I'd like to see in the report tomorrow, but sadly I don't think that's going to be in there.
Thank you so much, Alan. I suspect you may just have voiced what many others in the room are thinking as well, but I'm going to come to Zubaida and Matthew as well to see if they'd like to add to that. Zubaida.
Alan, you I think you did speak many of our thoughts there. Well, first of all, I have to confess that this is an issue very close to our hearts. I don't know if our viewers know, but the Equality Trust is a member of the Structural Inequalities Alliance, which we formed with the CBI, sort of several think tanks like Pro Bono Economics, Women's Budget Group, third sector organisations. And the reason we came together is because we were quite concerned about the government's levelling up agenda. And we felt very strongly, especially having seen what we've seen in the pandemic, that it wasn't addressing the structural inequalities in our country. Those very inequalities, which literally meant the difference between mild infection or hospitalization, life or death, the government wasn't quite addressing those. And I think Alan's absolutely right to say that there's no question that the North has been underinvested in, that the North has been overlooked and ignored. And this isn't a Conservative government issue either. Let's face it, Labour governments in the past have also, or the one and only Labour government recently, has also overlooked and ignored the North. And so there's a huge argument for investing in the North. But I guess the issue is, and it's not one versus the other, the issue is it's not a North-South issue around inequality. It is an issue about inequality across the country. Now, one of the things I mentioned before is child poverty rates. And when you look at child poverty rates, what's revealing is the highest rates of child poverty are in areas like the Northeast, which have been neglected and overlooked. But also, when you look at the top 10 areas of the highest rates of child poverty, a lot of them fall within London. Now, it's not in this government's interest to really look at London. It's predominantly Labour. You've got Sadiq Khan as the mayor. For the government, this is a political issue. But for the rest of us, if you're really serious about levelling up the country, then you can't just level up areas. You have to level up people. You have to level up groups. You have to recognise that disadvantage is by group status as well, whether it's disabled group status, Black and ethnic minority background, or in terms of socioeconomic status, that is very real. So I guess I would say that we can hope for the best. We don't know what's going to come out, but not very optimistic, I think, at the moment. But that doesn't mean that we can't change things. So one place to start is, if you're an organisation out there, please get in touch with the Equality Trust and we will tell you more about the Structural Inequalities Alliance. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Zubaida. Matthew, would you like to comment on levelling up?
Yeah, so I mean, I completely agree with everything just said in terms of the structural inequalities, and we are all aware kind of what the perception is of London, and I think it gets back to this question of especially with young people, we're not really quite sure what levelling up ultimately means. We know what the principle of it is, but if you take, for example, the Youth Investment Fund, which was announced months ago, £50 million, now recently, for whatever timing reasons, 10 million has been initially suggested to be put out. But it's only going to be for 2 London boroughs, Tower Hamlet, Barking and Dagenham. Before, as said, there's the top 10 boroughs of poverty in London. If you smarter people than me have looked at the formula and tried to work it out, there are some kind of boroughs up the north, which, not necessarily as bad for young people in terms of socioeconomic data than London, but London was left out of the formula. So how's it kind of working? Even with the 10 million that they initially put out, the time frame was sort of 3 months to kind of apply for it. And it was only capital funding, so kind of improvements to youth councils, maybe a new boiler or something like that, not really addressing that actual key thing when it comes to levelling up, which is those structural inequalities. I think the Education Minister announced the educational investment areas again. Let's see if let's see how that's calculated, let's see how much London gets. And the problem is that there is real kind of inequalities even within London. There's a real issue within inner and outer London, and the attainment gap, air pollution, for example. Loads of young people who live in outer London, they see London as a place of opportunity, but they feel like they have to leave their areas, they have to leave their localities to go and get that opportunity. There's a real divide there. There's no cohesive offer across London. How does London kind of have a cohesive careers advice and guidance service? How does youth service access not being a postcode lottery? And opportunity is there for all young Londoners, depending on, regardless of what kind of borough they're in, financial advice and guidance. Requirements for freedom passes for disabled young people kind of differ depending on the borough you're in, different application processes. There are 32 different boroughs. It can be really confusing. In London. I think the one thing I'll say is I think London Council did a really interesting response paper there. And if we're talking about levelling up, the devolution of the 16-19 funding just to get a coherent skill system in place is really important. Making sure that the UK Shared Prosperity Fund is matching the European Structural Investment Funds, and making sure that local leaders in local areas can actually make decisions about delivery for their local young people, really level up the skills agenda in London.
Thank you so much, Matthew. I'm going to come to audience questions now. Normally, I would sort of try to group questions together around which ones were floating miraculously to the top of my screen. The one that's currently at the top of my screen is from my boss, which may or may not be a coincidence. However, I know that Zubaida needs to leave us because she has a meeting that can't be moved. So I'm going to start with some questions that I think may be particularly relevant to you, Zubaida, if I may, and so try to bring two together in the interests of time. Kirsten Galea, and I hope, Kirsten, that I pronounced your name correctly, asks whether TfL has been coordinating with your organisations about transport cuts. You may be able to answer that on behalf of the Equality Trust, or that may not be the sort of thing you do as an organisation. And have you any confidence that equality impact assessments will be done? And then we have a linked question from an anonymous attendee who asks whether equality impact assessments are done on national rail or tube fare price increases, and is there a broader issue that that the costs of travel aren't, that people who are affected by increases to the cost of travel aren't consulted, and so those issues aren't visible. Grateful for any reflections you have on those, Zubaida. Thank you.
I think some of those are rhetorical questions, aren't they? Because I think the answers are very much included in them. Look, I mean, the Equality Act, under the Equality Act, public authorities are supposed to be carrying out equality impact assessments on any policies that affect the public. Now, the problem is that hasn't happened extensively, and certainly from a central government perspective, and under this particular government, equality impact assessments are seen as more red tape, more nuisance, more of a nuisance. And that was really obvious when it came to the pandemic. It was really obvious when policies were being rolled out that equality impact assessments were not being carried out in terms of the impact on women, in terms of the impact on deprived areas, in terms of the impact on Black and ethnic minority groups and disabled groups, in terms of shielding and so on. So we've got an issue across the board. Now, the problem with transport across the country is a lot of it is privatized. And so how you get private companies to carry out equality impact assessments is a big question. And I think this comes down to the issue of what can you do locally. And Claire and I had a chat about this a little while ago about what can you do locally versus nationally. And it is right, it is absolutely right that we go back to the government and we ask for better investment in transport, which affects everybody, whether it's privately, whether it's privately run or government investment. There should be subsidies in London, because transport is so integral to not only access to jobs, access to schools and so on, but in terms of equality of opportunity, something that the government talks about all the time. We need to see that that becomes a reality. But from a local perspective, I think it's about transport companies, including the GLA. It's about local authorities, local organizations reaching out to those with lived experiences about transport. It is really, that's what equality impact assessment is to some extent. It's not just about taking into account those with protected characteristics. It's really about taking into account all the diverse experiences of a particular public sector area. And in this case, it's transport, which I said could be private or public. But we need to carry that out. And that means reaching out locally to those voices. But from the other side, it means that local people themselves can think about how they can coalesce, how they can form alliances to influence some of those, to influence the policymakers. But at the same time, I'm also going to say, and this is the last thing I'll say on this, Claire, which is we cannot just leave it to people to get their voices heard. This is where local decision makers in transport, local authorities, third sector organizations, voluntary organizations need to be reaching out to those hard to reach voices, needing to help them to amplify their voices, thinking about ways that we can connect those voices to policymakers so that then policy around transport actually works for those on the ground.
Thank you so much, Zubaida. So many interesting things you covered there. So very glad you were able to get to those. We've got a couple of questions which I think are very strongly linked, so I'm going to ask them together. They come from my boss, our Chief Executive, Dr. Nick Bowes. If the government doesn't provide more money for Transport for London, what's the fairest way to raise extra income to fill the budget gap? And a connected one from Patrick Hennessy: would the panel prefer to see the mayor, what would the panel prefer to see the mayor do to plug the funding gap rather than council tax increases? And he asks whether it's more charges on motorists. Matthew, I know that you have contact with a whole range of young people through your work, and I wonder if that's anything that that comes up in your discussions, and if you'd like to start.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously one of the key things for us in terms of funding TfL is if fares have to go up. There's always an argument about TfL fares being more expensive than parts of, for example, the European public transport system because of that investment needed to keep London kind of developing and new things opening. But I think what's really clear today, if we're talking about structural inequality and such a different picture for different young people, it's how do you do that equality impact assessment, and how do you create a range of kind of progressive tools to make sure that actually you soften the impact on those groups. If you have to raise fares, how can you protect, care experienced young people who are not in employment, training or education? How can you make sure that the settlement for apprenticeship for people doing an apprenticeship is fair, so you're not seeing a negative impact on apprenticeship take-up levels? If they're looking at education, how is the relationship between the distance of education providers for sixth forms or other opportunities, and how do you make sure that any increase in fares doesn't kind of impact that? And I think we're just looking at all of those things, and that's just for young people as well. I think, again, to kind of echo the council tax thing, it is a regressive tax. It hits loads of people. It's kind of that blunt instrument. And actually, TfL have that opportunity, and don't get me wrong, it is difficult, and we don't want to create a really complicated fare system that people don't understand. But it's about how can they try and sort of create different sections or tiers or approaches. I mean, I thought the Sadiq Khan bus hopper thing was fantastic. You know, most young people in focus groups don't know about it that I speak to, but when you explain it to them, they think it's fantastic. So it's kind of innovative approaches to that, you know, understanding the behaviours of how people are using transport and how can you facilitate better access, better opportunity in a fair way. You know, I think we have to think really cleverly and innovative about it and not just go more increases in tax or more increases in fares, because we already know about the negative impact that will cause.
Thanks so much, Matthew. Really, really interesting. Alan, would you like to come in on this question about how we can raise money in a fair way?
So I will. I just wanted to comment on the equality impact assessment.
Of course, please.
That Sabrina and Matthew have already mentioned. I would echo everything that they've said. In particular, I think another thing that I would add is that we know that where impact assessments are being done, they are routinely being done very badly. You know, it's something that Zubaida touched on. The groups that are being affected are not being consulted. But not only that, it's not good enough just to go out and consult individuals. You need to actually engage proper professionals who understand the areas that they're talking about. And I think a good part of the problem is equality impact assessments are being done by an individual or a small group of individuals that have no real understanding of the broad range of impacts and the broad range of people that are being affected by these changes. In terms of where do we cut funding, I think one of the complicating factors, of course, is that these things don't stand in isolation. And so we know that, for example, traffic speeds dramatically affect the use of buses. So as congestion goes up, as bus journey times increase, then bus usage decreases. And it's very easy to get into a death spiral of services that just that dwindle away to nothing if we're not careful. So it's really important to understand the various impacts of the green agenda and congestion and air quality and all of that, the active travel. They're all interdependent. And I think we know that from the cuts that the bus route cuts in the central London before the pandemic, we know that the impacts on people haven't been properly understood. So a lot of disabled people that used to travel on bus through central London, through Oxford Street, now can't do that without changing buses and are no longer making those journeys. So we need to be very careful about understanding the impacts of the cuts that we've got. I noticed in one of the chats that came up that somebody was asking about how do you prioritise the cuts in the various services. If you're looking at education, you're looking at social care, you're looking at parks, recreation. You know, these are all these are all competing for often the same pots of money or closely linked pots of money. I think transport is somewhat unique in all of this because it's not a service in and of itself. Now, I know very few people that actually jump on the tube or the bus for a journey. they actually want to go somewhere and do something. Transport is an enabler. And without transport there, all other things suffer. So I think that's a priority to keep transport funding. And I think I've avoided the question by saying what we should cut and by saying it just shouldn't be transport.
Thanks, Alan. I think we'll get away with you not let you get away with not directly answering the question, because there was lots of really interesting stuff in there. I think my 3-year-old son might be one of those very few people who likes to go on the bus just for the sake of having a journey and would very happily just go round and round the buses in my area all day. But I imagine he'll grow out of that at some point. We've got a question from Charles Wright here about what contacts panelists and their organisations have had to do with London's MPs on this issue, and are the capital's MPs doing enough to stand up for all their constituents on this? I think I'm going to take this briefly from a Centre for London perspective and then pass over to Matthew and Alan. We, of course, try to, as a think tank is what we do, try to talk to London's MPs about what we think the city needs. We know a lot of the capital's MPs are interested in levelling up and are looking for ways to make the argument that levelling up needs to include London. So that's one of the tasks that we're trying to work on. On a personal note, I feel I should say, because MPs get a lot of stick, but I did contact my local MP about transport issues fairly recently, and they very quickly got back to me and said they were going to look into it, and then the next day said they'd had a meeting with the relevant transport company, and that's what came out of it. So I think, there certainly are MPs out there who are working really hard on this stuff. Matthew and Alan, how do you feel about how our MPs here in London are doing on this issue, and what would you like to see from them?
I mean, speaking from our perspective, I mean, we do work with some MPs. They do, they do a really difficult job. They're really interested. They recognise certain key demographic facts around London being a young city and the need of the cost of living crisis here. And, I think they are really good advocates for it. And, I'm aware that Centre for London, you guys do some great work with MPs. I think from our perspective, though, we're looking more at, regional government and devolution as probably the agenda track to get some of this achieved on. It's slightly different, but I think it's, should be a part of the conversation around levelling up is vote for 16. And now we're at the first time where London and England is unequal with its neighbours. Wales has brought in vote to 16. Scotland has already done vote to 16. So now London is behind. Andy Burnham was looking at it and made some kind of big noises about it. So maybe Manchester will get votes to 16 in their mayoral elections before London. So part of that conversation, we will have a conversation with Kat Smith about it, and it's really interesting. She's really keen on thinking about it from a parliamentary point, a nation point, thinking about what it looks like across the UK. But actually, there are certain areas, especially when we're looking at levelling up, where we need to be looking at this cohesively as a region. We need to be bringing together local partners and stakeholders and thinking about that devolution agenda more than necessarily looking at Westminster and a nationwide solution for some of these problems.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Alan, would you like to come in on London's MPs and how they're doing? You're on mute, Alan.
There you go, on the second one today. Matthew touched on an interesting point, that it's not just MPs that are useful to us, and certainly the Assembly members are very engaged, particularly the Transport Committee, and local boroughs are also very engaged in transport issues. And so I think at the micro level, all three of those different levels of government are playing a really significant part, as you said, Claire, and contacting individuals about particular issues is getting a lot of traction, and particularly in West London, where I am. There's been a lot of talk about the timetable changes on SWR, which have been campaigned on by our local MPs here. So I think there are significant movements, and we certainly at Transport for All, we regularly talk to a number of MPs and have some very good, very useful dialogue. I think the issue is changing policy at the government level. I think the change in approach that we've seen since the Prime Minister left London, his attitudes toward transport in London have apparently changed. And I'm at a loss for how we get that promotion that he pushed as mayor and some of the policies that he was promoting then into his policy portfolio. If anyone has any suggestions, I'd love to hear them.
Thanks so much, Alan. I feel like we could let this conversation go on and on, but I must bring it to a close, sadly, because we're nearly at 12 o'clock. I'm sorry there were so many questions that we weren't able to answer. I wish we'd been able to answer them all. I know that there's one from Linda that was quite a specific technical question to Matthew, so I'll ask if we can get that question emailed to Matthew and maybe you can answer it that way, if that's okay. Thank you so much to Alan and Matthew for being really brilliant and interesting panelists today, and also, of course, to Zubaida in her absence. We will email her and say that. And it's been really great to have the opportunity to talk with you all and to engage in this really difficult, chewy question. I hope we've managed to cover at least some of the very many and complex angles on this issue. And please do continue to use the hashtag if you would like to on Twitter to continue the discussion. As we mentioned earlier, we are doing absolutely loads of work on levelling up, as you would expect. So thank you very much to our funders for that Levelling Up project, which this event forms part of. We're gearing up for the white paper tomorrow. We're getting our research analyst hats ready and our comms hats all ready to respond to that, and we'll be getting out responses to that and to the Transport for London deal when it comes, and specifically on what they mean for London on our social media channels and on our blog and through our media appearances where we can get them. So please do keep an eye out for that, and please do get in touch if you'd like to be part of those discussions. I've been getting loads of emails from all sorts of people in different parts of London saying that they'd like to talk about the Levelling Up agenda and what it means for their particular geographic area or for the people who they work with or for their organisation. It really does seem like this is something that's really engaging people and getting lots of attention, which is great that there's an issue that people are united around, but less great that it's one that does seem to be causing real worry and concern for a lot of people. Before I go, I have one more public announcement, which is that we're looking for a new chair of